The crisp autumn air carried the sharp report of precision rifle fire across the training grounds at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. 12 distinct shots from an M24 sniper weapon system echoed in rapid succession, each one like the metronome of death itself. The early morning mist still clung to the rolling hills of the Special Forces training facility, where America's most elite warriors were forged in fire and discipline. Colonel Richard Hargrove stood with his arms crossed over his broad chest, a smug smile playing across his weathered face. At 63, he was still built like the Delta Force operator he'd been for 30 years. 6'2", ramrod straight, with steel gray hair cropped military short. The morning sunlight glinted off the silver eagle on his collar as he watched the Special Forces qualification course with critical eyes. "Pathetic," he muttered loud enough for the gathered officers to hear. 7 out of 12 on target. Standards have gone to hell since I ran this place. The young sergeant who had just completed his round lowered his rifle, jaw clenched tight at the colonel's criticism. No one dared contradict Hargrove. Not here. Not on his turf. As commander of the 3rd Special Forces Group, Hargrove ruled Fort Bragg's training grounds like a feudal lord, his word as immutable as scripture. "Back in my day, Hargrove continued, his voice carrying across the range, we didn't qualify unless we hit 10 out of 12 minimum. He turned to address the assembled Special Forces candidates. "You want to wear the green beret? You better damn well earn it." The gathering of battle-hardened warriors and hopeful recruits stood silent, no one willing to challenge the colonel's authority. This was hallowed ground where America's most lethal soldiers were selected, trained, and deployed to protect the nation's interests worldwide. The sound of another rifle being prepared echoed across the range as the next shooter readied himself. Then came a sound that stopped everyone in their tracks. Not gunfire, but footsteps. Light, determined, and utterly out of place in this sanctuary of warriors. Half a mile away, concealed at the edge of the forest line, Master Sergeant Frank Martinez observed the scene through compact military binoculars. At 70, his body bore the marks of a lifetime of service, scars from Vietnam to Afghanistan, each with its own story. But his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing as he watched a small figure approach the firing range. A smile creased his weathered face. The opening move in a game decades in the making was about to be played. The small figure appeared at the edge of the firing range, moving with purpose toward the assembled soldiers. The men parted instinctively, revealing a 12-year-old girl with blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, walking directly toward Colonel Hargrove. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, a simple blue t-shirt, and a light jacket against the autumn chill, but carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of a military child. In her small hands, she clutched a framed photograph in what appeared to be an old journal, worn at the edges from frequent handling. Her chin was lifted high, her blue eyes focused with an intensity that seemed impossibly mature for her age. A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the assembled men. Children were strictly forbidden in the training areas of Fort Bragg, especially on live fire ranges. Security protocols were ironclad. This area was restricted to authorized personnel only. "What the hell?" Hargrove's voice cut through the murmurs, his face darkening with anger. "Who let a kid onto my range?" The girl continued forward until she stood directly before the colonel, utterly unintimidated by his towering presence or obvious displeasure. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the suddenly silent range. "Colonel Hargrove, sir, my name is Grace Harper. I've come to request permission to use the firing range today." The silence that followed was profound, then broken by Hargrove's bark of laughter, quickly joined by nervous chuckles from several of his staff officers. The colonel's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the girl. "This is a restricted military facility, not a playground, young lady. How did you even get past security?" Grace stood her ground, unflinching. 3 years ago today, my father was killed in action in Syria. I want to honor his memory by practicing what he taught me." She held up the framed photograph for Hargrove to see. Inside the simple wooden frame was a Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, alongside a weathered green beret. Beneath them was a photograph of a soldier in full combat gear, his face bearing a striking resemblance to the girl standing before them. Hargrove's smile faded as recognition dawned in his eyes. Lieutenant Michael Harper, Grace said, watching the colonel's face carefully. My father. The name fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through the assembled Special Forces operators. The older men exchanged glances, heavy with meaning, while the younger ones looked confused, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere, but not understanding its cause. For a moment, Colonel Hargrove seemed frozen, his face a carefully controlled mask. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its thunder. I knew your father, girl. He was under my command. He looked around at the gathered men, then back at Grace. But this is no place for a child. How did you even get on base? Mrs. Rodriguez at the front gate recognized me, Grace answered simply. I'm a dependent with proper ID. I've lived on base most of my life. She paused. She called ahead to your office, but I guess they didn't tell you I was coming. Hargrove glanced sharply at his aide, who shrugged helplessly, clearly caught off guard. Well, this is still a restricted area, Hargrove continued, and even if it weren't, what you're asking is absurd. This is a military firing range, not a memorial site. These weapons aren't toys. Grace's gaze never wavered. I know what they are, sir. My father taught me from the time I was 6 years old. A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. Hargrove's face darkened again. Your father had no business teaching a child to shoot military weapons. Now I suggest you turn around and leave before I have security escort you out. Grace didn't move. Instead, she opened the journal she carried and pulled out a folded document. I have all the proper paperwork, sir. Family Support Services approved my request to use the range under supervision for memorial purposes. It's signed by Captain Hernandez from Family Affairs. Hargrove snatched the paper from her hand, scanning it with growing irritation. The document was indeed official, with all the proper stamps and signatures. Captain Hernandez had even added a personal note explaining the unusual circumstances and requesting special consideration on the anniversary of Lieutenant Harper's death. This is ridiculous, Hargrove muttered, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. Denying a formal request to honor a fallen Medal of Honor recipient, especially one filed through proper channels, could create unwanted attention. Colonel, one of the older sergeants said quietly, Lieutenant Harper was a hero. Maybe we could. I know exactly who Harper was, Sergeant, Hargrove snapped, cutting him off. His eyes never left Grace's face, studying her with a new intensity. What did you say your name was again, girl? Grace Harper, sir, and I am Michael Harper's daughter. Something shifted in Hargrove's expression, a calculation, a measurement of risk and reward. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well then, he said, his voice dangerously smooth, perhaps we should see what the daughter of the legendary Lieutenant Harper can do. He turned to the range. Sergeant Miller, set up a target at 500 meters for our special guest. A murmur ran through the assembled men. 500 meters was a serious distance, challenging even for qualified snipers. For a 12-year-old girl, it was absurd, clearly meant to humiliate. Sir, Sergeant Miller began hesitantly, that's a qualification-level distance. I'm aware of that, Sergeant, Hargrove cut him off. Miss Harper here believes she's qualified to use my range. I think it's only fair we find out if that's true. He turned back to Grace, that cold smile still in place. If you can hit 3 out of 10 shots on target at 500 meters, I'll sign your range permission myself. But when you fail, and you will fail, you'll leave my base and never come back with these ridiculous requests. Do we have a deal? Grace met his gaze steadily. Yes, sir, we have a deal. The name Michael Harper had once been spoken with reverence throughout the Special Forces community. As the scene at the range unfolded, the memories of Fallujah, Iraq, 2004, burned bright in the minds of those who had been there. The city had been a nightmare maze of bombed-out buildings and narrow alleyways where death waited around every corner. A platoon of Marines had been pinned down by insurgent fire, trapped in the killing zone with 3 men already wounded and ammunition running low. Their desperate radio calls for help had gone unanswered for nearly an hour as enemy fire made extraction impossible. Lieutenant Michael Harper, then a young Special Forces operator on his second deployment, had been positioned on overwatch duty, manning an M24 sniper rifle from a partially collapsed apartment building 800 meters away. His spotter, Frank Martinez, lay beside him, scanning the chaos through high-powered binoculars. Command says negative on permission to engage, Martinez reported, the frustration evident in his voice as he listened to the radio. Captain Hargrove wants us to maintain position and await further orders. Harper's face was a mask of concentration as he tracked the enemy fighters through his scope. 8 insurgents with AK-47s and RPGs had the Marine platoon completely pinned down. Without intervention, it was only a matter of time before they were overrun. "Those boys have 10 minutes, maybe less," Harper said quietly, never taking his eye from the scope. "We're the only ones who can help them." Martinez looked at his friend, understanding the choice that lay before them. "Orders are orders, Mike." Hargrove was explicit. Harper was silent for a long moment, watching through his scope as another Marine was hit, his comrades dragging him to scant cover behind a destroyed Humvee. "Some orders shouldn't be followed," he said finally, his voice calm and certain. "Call it in. I'm engaging." What followed became the stuff of military legend, though few would ever hear the true story. 8 shots in under 2 minutes, each finding its mark with devastating precision. 8 insurgents neutralized, allowing the Marine platoon to evacuate their wounded and retreat to safety. When Harper and Martinez returned to base, they found Captain Richard Hargrove waiting barsing, his face twisted with fury. "You disobeyed a direct order, Lieutenant," Hargrove snarled. "I expressly told you to hold position." Harper stood at attention, his face betraying nothing. "With respect, sir, those Marines would have died if we hadn't acted." "That wasn't your call to make," Hargrove shouted. "This isn't about those Marines. This is about the chain of command. This is about discipline." What Harper didn't know then, what he wouldn't discover until much later, was that Hargrove had already begun rewriting the narrative. In his official report, Hargrove claimed he had authorized the engagement, presenting himself as the decisive commander who had saved the Marine platoon. Harper's role was minimized to that of a trigger puller simply following orders. The Marines told a different story, of course. They reported that Harper's marksmanship had saved their lives when no other help was forthcoming. But their statements were quietly buried, deemed inconsistent with official records, by Hargrove's superiors, who had no reason to doubt the word of a respected officer over the confused recollections of combat-stressed Marines. The aftermath was as swift as it was unjust. Hargrove received a Silver Star and promotion for his quick thinking and decisive leadership. Harper received a formal reprimand for failing to properly document engagement protocols, a minor infraction, but enough to stall his career for years. Martinez had urged Harper to fight back, to tell the truth about what happened. But Harper, ever the idealist, had refused. "The mission succeeded," he'd said simply. "Those Marines made it home. That's what matters. Not medals, not promotions." So Harper had kept his silence, accepting the reprimand with stoic dignity. He'd continued serving with distinction, eventually rebuilding his reputation through sheer excellence in the field. But he kept meticulous records of everything: dates, permissions, locations, radio transcripts, carefully documented in the journal his daughter now carried. And Hargrove had never forgotten the man who knew the truth about his stolen valor. By 2016, Michael Harper had risen to become one of the most respected snipers in Special Forces history, despite Hargrove's efforts to minimize his achievements. Operating in the mountains of Afghanistan, Harper established a confirmed kill at 1,657 meters, a shot that required calculating for wind speed, bullet drop, the Coriolis effect, and a dozen other factors that would challenge a mathematician, let alone a man with a rifle under enemy fire. The shot became legendary among snipers worldwide, though Harper himself never spoke of it. He wasn't a man who killed for glory or recognition. He was a guardian, a protector who saw his rifle as a tool for saving lives rather than taking them. "One shot, one life," he would often tell his daughter during their weekend training sessions. Not to kill, but to protect. Grace had been born into the tight-knit Special Forces community at Fort Bragg, her mother having died from complications during childbirth. She was, in many ways, a child raised by a village of warriors. The men of her father's unit became her uncles, teaching her everything from how to tie knots to how to navigate by the stars. But it was her father who recognized something special in her, an extraordinary natural talent that manifested when he first took her to the civilian range on her 6th birthday. Her small hands had been steady, her focus absolute. 3 shots, 3 bullseyes. Not luck, but an innate understanding of the relationship between breath, sight picture, and trigger squeeze. From that day forward, Harper had cultivated her gift, teaching her not just how to shoot, but why to shoot. The mathematics of ballistics, the physics of wind and weather, the discipline of the mind that separates a good shot from a great one. Shooting isn't about aggression, he would tell her as they lay side by side on the firing line. It's about perfect calm. Find the space between your heartbeats. That's where the perfect shot lives. By the time Grace was 9, she could consistently hit targets at 300 meters, an extraordinary achievement for a child her age. Harper never bragged about his daughter's abilities, keeping their training sessions private. In a community where some might question the wisdom of teaching a child such skills, he preferred to avoid unnecessary controversy. But Martinez knew. As Harper's closest friend and former spotter, he had often joined their weekend sessions, watching with quiet amazement as the young girl absorbed lessons that seasoned operators struggled to master. "She's a natural, Mike," Martinez had said once, watching Grace adjust her scope for a tricky crosswind. "Better than you were at twice her age." Harper had smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "She's going to break every record I ever set. Just wait and see." He never lived to see that prediction fulfilled. 3 years ago, Harper had led a Delta Force team on a high-risk extraction mission in Syria. Intelligence had been faulty. Instead of the expected light resistance, they'd walked into a carefully prepared ambush. Outnumbered and outgunned, Harper had called for emergency air support. The request had reached Colonel Hargrove, by then promoted to command the 3rd Special Forces Group. Hargrove, recognizing Harper's voice on the transmission, had delayed the response, claiming insufficient intelligence to authorize air assets. With no support forthcoming, Harper had made a fateful decision. Using himself as bait, he'd drawn enemy fire away from his wounded teammates, allowing them to reach extraction. He'd fought with extraordinary courage, holding off the attacking force single-handedly until a bullet found its mark. By the time air support finally arrived, ordered by another officer who'd overheard the desperate calls, Michael Harper was dead, his body surrounded by 18 enemy fighters he'd taken with him. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The official report praised his extraordinary heroism and selfless sacrifice. What it didn't mention was the 37-minute delay between his initial call for support and the arrival of help. Minutes that might have saved his life had Hargrove acted promptly. Only Martinez and a few survivors knew the truth. They tried to launch an investigation, but Hargrove had powerful allies by then. The matter was deemed classified for national security, the records sealed, the questions unanswered. For 3 years, Grace had lived with her grandparents on base, carrying the weight of her father's legacy and the unanswered questions about his death. For 3 years, she'd maintained the rituals he taught her, the breathing exercises, the focus drills, the mental mathematics of ballistics. And for 3 years, she'd waited for the right moment to reveal what she knew. That moment had finally arrived. As the range was prepared for Grace's challenge, Martinez made a series of quick phone calls from the concealment of the tree line. Within minutes, several older men began to arrive at the range, filtering in casually, as if they'd always intended to be there. They were a weathered bunch, most in their 60s and 70s, with the unmistakable bearing of career military men. They wore civilian clothes now, but the green beret pins on their caps told their story clearly enough. These were the old guard, retired Special Forces operators who had served with distinction across decades of America's conflicts. Gulf War veterans, Rangers from Panama, Delta operators from a dozen black ops, men who had fought in shadows across the world to protect their country's interests. They nodded to each other with quiet recognition, positioning themselves strategically around the range, their presence creating an unexpected gallery for Grace's test. Hargrove noticed their arrival with narrowing eyes, recognizing many faces from years past. "Quite the audience gathering," he remarked to his aide. "Someone's been making calls." His aide shifted uncomfortably. "Should I ask them to leave, sir?" Hargrove considered for a moment, then shook his head. "No, let them watch. It might be educational for them to see what happens when sentimentality overrides common sense. At the firing line, Grace stood quietly as Sergeant Miller explained the rules of the challenge. Standard qualification protocol, he told her, his voice professional but kind. 10 rounds, target at 500 meters. 3 hits on the silhouette would be considered minimally qualifying for a Special Forces candidate. He hesitated, then added more gently, "That's a very difficult standard, young lady. No one would think less of you if you reconsidered this challenge." Grace looked up at him, her blue eyes calm and focused. "I'm ready, Sergeant." Miller nodded, respecting her determination, if not her chances of success. He gestured to the weapon rack. "You'll need to select a rifle." Grace walked to the rack, her eyes scanning the available options. After a moment's consideration, she selected an M24, the same model her father had carried in Fallujah, the same one she'd trained with under his guidance. The rifle was almost as long as she was tall, designed for adult male operators, not 12-year-old girls. Several of the younger soldiers exchanged skeptical glances, a few smirking openly at the sight of the small girl with the oversized weapon. Hargrove watched with poorly concealed satisfaction, clearly anticipating her embarrassment. "You might want to start with something smaller," he called out. "That rifle has quite a kick." Grace ignored him, carrying the M24 to the firing position with practiced ease. Her movements as she set up were methodical and precise, laying out the ammunition, checking the barrel for obstructions, adjusting the bipod legs to the perfect height for her prone position. Martinez watched from the sidelines, his face impassive but his eyes missing nothing. He noted the perfect form as Grace settled into position behind the rifle, body aligned properly with the target, cheek weld secure against the stock, breathing controlled and even. These weren't things a novice would know. These were the fundamentals that separated professionals from amateurs. Hargrove stepped closer, his shadow falling across Grace as she prepared. "I knew your father, girl," he said, his voice pitched low so only she could hear. He was reckless, insubordinate, the kind of man who got himself killed because he wouldn't follow orders. Grace's hands paused momentarily on the rifle, but her face revealed nothing of her thoughts. She continued her preparations, working the bolt to ensure smooth operation, checking the magazine, adjusting the scope with small, precise movements. "You have no business being here," Hargrove continued, pressing his psychological advantage. "This isn't some game. These men have trained for years to earn the right to be on this range." When Grace finally spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "My father earned a Medal of Honor on your watch, Colonel Isle. He died saving his men while waiting for support that never came." She looked up at him then, her young face solemn. "I think we both know why that was." Hargrove's face hardened, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his calculated intimidation. Before he could respond, Sergeant Miller intervened. "Sir, we're ready to proceed with the qualification test." Hargrove stepped back, his composure quickly restored. "By all means, Sergeant, let's get this over with." Miller turned to Grace. 10 rounds, 500 meters. Whenever you're ready, Miss Harper." Grace nodded and turned her full attention to the task at hand. She settled behind the rifle, her small body finding the correct position with practiced ease. The M24 was heavy, designed for men twice her size, but she had trained with similar weapons under her father's guidance. Her muscles remembered. The range fell silent as Grace prepared for her first shot. Even the skeptics were watching now, curious to see how this unusual scenario would play out. The old guard veterans stood particularly still, their weathered faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. Grace's world narrowed to the fundamentals her father had drilled into her since she was 6 years old. Body position, breath control, sight picture, wind calculation. She drew a slow breath, held it gently, and found that perfect space between heartbeats that her father had taught her to recognize. That moment of absolute stillness, where nothing exists but the perfect alignment of eye, scope, and target. Her fingers squeezed the trigger with smooth, even pressure. The rifle barked, its report echoing across the range. Grace absorbed the recoil, quickly realigning for her second shot. 9 more times she repeated the process, each shot delivered with the same methodical precision, each one followed by the efficient manipulation of the bolt to chamber the next round. When the last shot had been fired, a profound silence fell over the range. Grace sat up, engaging the safety on the rifle before setting it down carefully, just as her father had taught her. She looked towards Sergeant Miller, waiting for the results. Miller lowered his spotting scope, his face carefully neutral as he turned to Colonel Hargrove. "Would you like to verify the target yourself, sir?" Hargrove nodded stiffly, taking the offered spotting scope. As he focused on the distant target, the assembled soldiers watched his face, looking for some reaction to what he saw. For several long moments, Hargrove said nothing, adjusting the focus as if not believing what he was seeing. When he finally lowered the scope, his expression was thunderous. "This is impossible," he said flatly. "The target must have been pre-marked." Miller looked uncomfortable. "Sir, I personally set up a fresh target before the test. There was no opportunity for tampering." "Then check it again," Hargrove snapped. One of the old guard veterans stepped forward, a tall, lean man with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in harsh conditions. "I'll verify it," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of long command. "I believe we'd all appreciate an objective assessment." Hargrove hesitated, clearly recognizing the man but unwilling to concede the point. After a moment, he nodded curtly. "Fine, Sergeant Wilson can confirm." The veteran, apparently Sergeant Wilson, took the spotting scope and studied the distant target carefully. After a thorough examination, he lowered the scope and turned to address the assembled men. 10 shots, 10 hits, he announced, his voice pitched to carry across the range. All in the center mass, grouping tighter than I've seen from most qualified snipers. He turned to Grace, giving her a respectful nod. "Exceptional shooting, Miss Harper. Your father would be proud." A murmur ran through the gathered soldiers. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't dismiss the assessment of a veteran like Wilson. Several of the younger operators looked at Grace with newfound respect, their earlier smirks replaced by expressions of genuine amazement. Hargrove's face had gone rigid, a muscle working in his jaw as he struggled to maintain his composure. "This proves nothing," he said tightly. "Anyone can get lucky once." "That wasn't luck, Colonel," Martinez said, finally stepping forward from the sidelines. "That was skill, the same skill her father had, the skill you've spent 20 years trying to diminish." A hush fell over the range as Martinez walked slowly toward Hargrove. Though 70 years old now, Master Sergeant Frank Martinez still moved with the deadly grace of the warrior he had been. His eyes, set deep in a face weathered by decades of sun and combat, never left Hargrove's face. "Frank," Hargrove said, his voice carefully controlled, "I didn't expect to see you here. Thought you'd retired to Florida." "I did," Martinez agreed, "until I got a call 3 years ago about Mike Harper dying while waiting for support that never came." He stopped a few paces from Hargrove, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard as flint. "Funny how history repeats itself, isn't it, Richard?" Hargrove's face flushed. "You're out of line, Martinez. You have no business on this range. None of you do," he added, looking around at the gathered veterans. "This is an active military facility, not a retirement home." Martinez smiled thinly. "We were invited by Captain Hernandez, the same officer who approved Grace's range time. Seems he thought this might be an event worth witnessing." "Captain Hernandez has exceeded his authority," Hargrove snapped, "and you're interfering with the official training operations." "No, sir," Miller interjected respectfully. "The qualification round is complete. The range is currently clear." He glanced at Grace, then back to Hargrove. "And according to the terms you set, Miss Harper has more than met the qualification standard." Hargrove turned to Grace, who stood quietly watching the confrontation. His eyes were cold, with barely suppressed fury. "You think this changes anything, girl? You think hitting a paper target makes you special?" "No, sir," Grace replied calmly. "What makes me special is knowing the truth about what happened to my father, and having proof." She held up the journal she'd brought with her, her father's mission log, with its detailed records of dates, times, and radio transcripts. "My father documented everything, Colonel, including your refusal to send air support when his team was ambushed in Syria." The assembled soldiers went utterly still, the accusation hanging in the air like the report of a rifle shot. Hargrove stared at Grace, then at the journal, his face paling slightly before his training reasserted itself. "That's classified information," he said coldly, "and even if it weren't, the ramblings in a personal journal hardly constitute evidence." "Perhaps not on their own," Martinez agreed, "but combined with his testimony of the Delta operators who survived that day and the radio logs that mysteriously disappeared from official records, but were backed up by the communications officer who suspected something was wrong. He smiled thinly. That might be enough to warrant an investigation. Hargrove looked around, suddenly aware of how the situation had shifted. What had begun as an opportunity to humiliate a presumptuous child had somehow transformed into something far more dangerous. The old guard veterans were watching him with knowing eyes. The younger operators were looking confused, uncertain, wondering what truth lay behind these accusations. "This is absurd," Hargrove said, fighting to regain control of the narrative. "You have no authority here, Martinez. None of you do, and dragging a child into your conspiracy theories is beneath even you." "I'm not a child," Grace said quietly, her voice somehow cutting through the tension. "I'm Lieutenant Harper's daughter, and I made a promise at his grave that I would restore his honor and expose the truth about how he died." She stepped forward, facing Hargrove directly despite being less than half his size. "My father taught me that a soldier's greatest duty isn't to follow orders blindly, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. He died living by that principle." She held up the journal again. "And I have proof that you left him to die because of a 20-year grudge over Fallujah." Hargrove's composure finally cracked. "You know nothing about Fallujah," he snapped, his voice rising. "Nothing about command decisions or the responsibilities of leadership. I know that my father saved 8 Marines that day while you sat safely in the command center," Grace replied. "I know you took credit for his actions and had him reprimanded when the Marines tried to tell the truth." A deadly silence fell over the range. Hargrove looked around, seeing the changing expressions on the faces of his men as they processed this information. The accusation wasn't just about Syria anymore. It went back years, suggesting a pattern of behavior that called into question his entire career. "This is insubordination," he said tightly. "Sergeant Miller, clear the range. Everyone back to their duties. This exhibition is over." Miller hesitated, looking from Hargrove to Grace to the assembled veterans. "Sir, about Miss Harper's range qualification." "To hell with her qualification," Hargrove snarled. "This entire exercise was a mistake. I'm ordering this range closed for the remainder of the day." Grace stood her ground, unflinching despite Hargrove's outburst. "We had a deal, Colonel. I hit the targets, more than 3 of them. You promised to sign my range permission." "And I'm revoking that promise," Hargrove said coldly. "This range is for military personnel only, not for children with delusions of grandeur and old men with grudges." Martinez stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Be careful, Richard. There are a lot of witnesses here today, a lot of phones recording." His eyes flicked meaningfully towards several of the younger operators, whose hands were indeed hovering near their pockets. "Do you really want to be seen refusing range access to the daughter of a Medal of Honor recipient on the anniversary of his death, especially after she just outshot most of your qualified snipers?" Hargrove glared at Martinez, then at the surrounding soldiers, many of whom did indeed have phones partially concealed in their hands. The political calculus was obvious. Denying Grace now, after her impressive performance, would look petty and vindictive. It would raise questions about why he was so determined to keep her away from the range, questions that might lead to uncomfortable investigations. For a long moment, the outcome hung in the balance. Then Hargrove's training reasserted itself. The political instinct that had helped him rise through the ranks despite his ethical shortcomings. He forced a thin smile. "Very well," he said, his voice artificially pleasant. "Miss Harper has indeed demonstrated remarkable proficiency. Sergeant Miller, please process her range permission." He looked directly at Grace, his eyes cold despite his smile. "Congratulations, young lady. It seems you inherited your father's talents." Grace held his gaze steadily, neither celebrating her victory nor acknowledging his barely concealed hostility. "Thank you, Colonel. I look forward to using the range regularly to honor my father's memory." Hargrove nodded stiffly, then turned to his aide. "I have meetings to attend. Handle this." Without another word, he strode away from the range, his back rigid with suppressed fury. As Hargrove disappeared from view, a subtle release of tension rippled through the assembled soldiers. Several of the old guard veterans approached Grace, offering quiet words of congratulation and respect. Martinez stood beside her, a protective presence as she accepted their acknowledgments, with the same composed dignity she'd shown throughout the confrontation. That was only the first step, Martinez said quietly when they had a moment alone. He won't forget this. He won't forgive it either. Grace nodded, watching the direction Hargrove had gone. I know, but now everyone else knows too. They saw what I can do. They heard what I said about my father. She looked up at Martinez, her young face solemn with purpose. And next time, I'm going to break my father's record. Right here, where everyone can see it. Martinez studied her face, seeing in it the same quiet determination that had defined Michael Harper. Your father once told me you'd break every record he ever set, he said. I'm starting to believe he was right. Grace looked down at the Medal of Honor in the frame she still carried. I made a promise, Sergeant Martinez. At Arlington, 3 years ago today, I promised him I'd restore his honor and show everyone the truth. And today was just the beginning, Martinez finished for her. Grace nodded, her blue eyes lifting to the distant target she'd just shot with such extraordinary precision. Just the beginning. That evening, as the sun set over Fort Bragg, a young lieutenant delivered an envelope to Grace. Inside was a terse note on official letterhead, bearing Colonel Hargrove's signature. While your performance today was impressive, it read, be advised that unauthorized discussion of classified operations, including those involving your father, constitutes a federal offense under the Espionage Act. Further range access will require my personal authorization. Grace folded the note carefully and tucked it into her father's journal. Hargrove had made his first countermove, but the game was just beginning, and Grace Harper had learned strategy from a master. She opened the journal to her father's final entry, written the night before he left for Syria. His words, penned in steady handwriting, seemed to speak directly to her across the years that separated them. Remember, Grace, the perfect shot isn't about the target. It's about truth. It's about justice. Find the space between heartbeats, and you'll never miss. 3 weeks passed. Autumn deepened across Fort Bragg, painting the North Carolina landscape in fierce oranges and deep reds as if nature itself had caught fire. But a different kind of fire had ignited across military circles and beyond. Digital wildfire that not even Colonel Richard Hargrove could extinguish. The video of Grace Harper's performance had escaped the confines of the military base, spreading across social media platforms with the unstoppable momentum of truth long suppressed. 12-year-old Outshot's Delta Force read the headlines, accompanied by footage captured on the smartphones of junior operators who had witnessed the event. The tight grouping of her shots, the perfect form, the composed face of a child performing at the level of elite warriors, it made for compelling viewing. Within the wood-paneled confines of his office, Colonel Hargrove stared at the Fox News segment playing on his computer screen. A retired Navy SEAL was being interviewed, analyzing Grace's technique with professional admiration. What we're seeing here is extraordinary, and the SEAL was saying. This level of marksmanship typically requires decades of training. The Harper girl demonstrates an intuitive understanding of ballistics that can't be taught. It can only be inherited and refined. Hargrove slammed his laptop closed as his legal advisor, Major Phillips, entered the office. I want it gone, Hargrove said without preamble. Every copy, every mention. This is a security breach. Phillips placed a folder on the desk, his expression carefully neutral. Sir, respectfully, that's not possible. The video has been viewed over 7 million times. CNN ran a segment this morning. They're calling her the prodigy sniper, the daughter of Medal of Honor recipient Michael Harper. Hargrove's jaw tightened visibly. Then we contain the damage. Issue a statement about security protocols being violated. Make it clear that no further unauthorized access to military facilities will be permitted. Yes, sir, Phillips nodded, then hesitated. There's something else. Captain Hernandez received another range request from the Harper girl. It's for the SFAMC. Hargrove's head snapped up. The Special Forces Advanced Marksmanship Center? That's absurd. That facility is reserved for our most elite operators. She's citing the precedent established by her previous approval, sir. And Phillips cleared his throat. The request has accumulated several endorsements from retired Special Operations personnel. Hargrove's face darkened. Martinez, he's behind this. Sir, if I may, Phillips ventured carefully, denying this request after her demonstrated proficiency might generate unwanted attention. especially given her father's status. Hargrove stood and walked to the window, looking out over the base that had been his domain for years. For a moment he was silent, calculating. Then a thin smile spread across his face. "Approve it." Phillips blinked in surprise. "Sir?" "Approve it," Hargrove repeated, turning back to face his aide. "But I want the SFAMC reconfigured to maximum difficulty, variable wins, reduced target exposure times, the works. If she wants to play with the professionals, let's see how she handles real pressure." The smile never reached his eyes. "And schedule it for when I can personally oversee the assessment." "Yes, sir." After Phillips departed, Hargrove unlocked his desk drawer and removed a thick file marked classified. Inside were the mission reports from Syria, carefully sanitized before submission to the Pentagon. He flipped through the pages until he found what he sought, the transcript of Harper's final transmission. His fingers traced the words he had memorized. "Saladin 6, this is Longshot. We are taking heavy fire. Request immediate air support at grid coordinates." Hargrove closed the file. Some ghosts refused to stay buried, but he had survived worse. A 12-year-old girl and a handful of aging veterans were not going to destroy the career he had built, regardless of what they thought they knew. In the modest home of Grace's grandparents, just outside Fort Bragg, Grace and Martinez sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by her father's journals. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating pages filled with Michael Harper's precise handwriting. Grace carefully turned a page in the journal, dated 2022. "Here it is," she said, pointing to an entry. "The day before Syria, Dad sent a SATCOM flash traffic directly to Colonel Hargrove." Martinez leaned closer, reading the entry. Harper had documented sending an urgent classified message warning of intelligence indicating a possible ambush at the insertion point. The message included specific details about enemy movements that contradicted their original briefing. "He knew," Martinez said quietly, the weight of confirmation heavy in his voice. "Hargrove knew they were walking into a trap and sent them anyway." Grace nodded, her young face solemn beyond her years. "And when Dad called for emergency support, Hargrove delayed responding for 37 minutes. She tapped another page where Harper had documented previous response times for similar requests. The standard protocol required response within 5 minutes. Martinez studied the girl across from him, the daughter of his closest friend, now the keeper of his legacy. She had her father's eyes, but more importantly, she had his unflinching moral compass and relentless pursuit of truth. "This is solid, Grace, but Hargrove will claim the journals are just personal records, not official documentation." "That's why we need more," Grace replied, closing the journal carefully. "We need witnesses. We need the communications logs. And we need people to see that I can do what Dad could do, so they'll believe what he wrote." Martinez smiled slightly. "Is that why you requested access to the SFAMC?" Grace nodded. "If I can perform there at the highest level, in front of witnesses, it validates everything. Dad always said, performance builds credibility." Martinez's weathered face grew serious. "You know Hargrove will make it as difficult as possible. The SFAMC is where the best of the best are tested. Experienced operators have failed there." Grace met his gaze steadily. "That's what I'm counting on. He'll try to make me fail in front of everyone. But when I succeed instead—" Martinez nodded slowly, understanding her strategy. "You're using his ego against him, just like your father would." A slight smile touched Grace's lips. "I had a good teacher." The Special Forces Advanced Marksmanship Center stood apart from the standard ranges at Fort Bragg, a state-of-the-art facility where America's most elite sharpshooters hone their craft. Unlike the predictable conditions of the qualification range, the SFAMC was designed to simulate the chaos of real combat environments. Variable winds generated by hidden fans could shift direction without warning. Targets appeared at random intervals and distances. Environmental factors changed mid-session. It was designed to break the best snipers in the world, forcing them to adapt or fail. No civilian had ever been permitted to shoot there, until today. The morning air carried the first hint of winter's approach as Grace walked toward the facility, Martinez at her side. Behind them followed several members of the Old Guard, retired Special Forces operators who had made it their mission to ensure Grace had a fair chance to prove herself. "Remember," Martinez said quietly as they neared the entrance, Hargrove agreed to this under pressure. He's expecting you to fail. Grace nodded, her face composed. I know. He'll have made it as difficult as possible. Changed the conditions, maybe tampered with the equipment. I know that too, Grace replied, her voice steady. Dad always said to prepare for the worst conditions you can imagine, then add rain. Martinez smiled slightly at the quote, one of Harper's favorite training maxims. Smart man, your father. At the entrance, they were met by Sergeant Miller, the range master who had overseen Grace's first demonstration. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a hint of respect as he greeted them. Miss Harper, he said with a nod, you and your observers are expected. He glanced at Martinez and the old guard veterans, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. Colonel Hargrove is waiting inside. Grace squared her slim shoulders. Thank you, Sergeant Miller. Inside, the advanced marksmanship facility was a marvel of military engineering. The main shooting area was twice the size of a standard range, with multiple firing positions arranged along a curved line. The target area beyond featured a complex terrain of artificial hills, structures, and vegetation that could be reconfigured to simulate various environments. Sophisticated electronic systems controlled everything from target presentation to environmental conditions. Colonel Hargrove stood at the center of the facility, surrounded by a group of officers and special operators. Grace recognized the distinctive insignia of Navy SEALs and Delta Force among them, the most elite warriors America produced. They turned as one when she entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to thinly veiled skepticism. Ah, Miss Harper, Hargrove said, his voice carrying across the space. Welcome to the SFAMC. Quite different from the basic range you shot on before, isn't it? Grace surveyed the facility with calm eyes. It's impressive, sir. This facility is where we separate the professionals from the amateurs, Hargrove continued. The advanced course record is held by Master Sergeant Jason Reed of Delta Force. 9 hits out of 10 at 800 meters in variable conditions. He gestured to a tall, powerfully built operator standing nearby, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. Today, Hargrove continued, you'll be attempting a modified version of our qualification course. 5 shots at 500 meters, followed by 5 more at 800. Variable wind conditions will be in effect. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Significantly more challenging than your previous demonstration. Martinez stepped forward. As we agreed, Grace will use the standard issue M24, unmodified. Hargrove nodded. Of course. We wouldn't want any advantages that might skew the results. He gestured to a weapon rack where a single rifle waited. Standard issue, checked and verified by Sergeant Miller this morning. Grace approached the rack, lifting the M24 with practiced hands. Immediately, her fingers detected something different. The balance was slightly off, the trigger pull heavier than standard. Not obvious changes, but subtle adjustments that would throw off a normal shooter. She caught Martinez's eye, a silent message passing between them. He nodded imperceptibly. They had anticipated this. For 3 weeks, Grace had trained on a dozen different rifles, each one subtly altered, each one presenting unique challenges. Martinez had called in favors from former armorers, having them modify weapons in ways that would normally disadvantage a shooter. Too heavy triggers, sticky bolts, imbalanced weight distribution. Grace had learned to compensate for all of them. Is there a problem with the weapon, Miss Harper? Hargrove asked, watching her examination closely. Grace tested the bolt action, feeling the slight catch that had been engineered into it. No, sir, it's fine. Hargrove looked almost disappointed. Very well. Take your position when ready. Sergeant Miller will walk you through the course parameters. As Grace moved to the firing line, Martinez and the old guard veterans positioned themselves strategically around the facility. They had discussed this extensively, ensuring that no matter what happened, multiple witnesses would have clear views of both Grace and the targets. Sergeant Miller approached, his manner professional but not unkind. Standard qualification protocol, modified for your unique circumstances, he explained. 5 rounds at 500 meters with variable winds up to 15 miles per hour, then 5 more at 800 meters with the same conditions. Targets will appear for 7 seconds each. Grace nodded, absorbing the information. 7 seconds per target was brutally fast for these distances. A test designed for experienced operators, not 12-year-old girls. Any questions? Miller asked. No, Sergeant, I'm ready. Miller nodded and stepped back. Commence when ready. Grace settled behind the rifle, her small frame finding the optimal position despite the weapon's altered balance. The first target would appear 500 meters out, a challenging distance for most shooters, but one she had mastered under her father's guidance. The gathered operators watched with varied expressions, some openly skeptical, others professionally curious. Master Sergeant Reed, the current record holder, studied her technique with particular interest, his experienced eye noting her textbook form. Bet you 50 she doesn't hit more than 2, one of the SEALs muttered to his companion. You're on, the other replied. Kid's got something. I can feel it. Grace tuned out the whispers, focusing entirely on the task ahead. She ran through the mental checklist her father had drilled into her since she was 6 years old. Breathing, control it. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Body position, straight line from shoulder to hip. Minimal contact with the ground. Let the earth hold you, not trap you. Cheek weld, consistent pressure, same spot every time. Eye relief, perfect distance from the scope, no shadowing. As she completed each mental check, Grace felt herself entering the state her father had called shooter's mind. That perfect balance between relaxation and focus, where the outside world faded away, leaving only the shooter, the weapon, and the target. A red light flashed, signaling the imminent appearance of the first target. Grace's world narrowed to the view through her scope, her breathing slowing to the measured rhythm her father had taught her. The target appeared, a standard military silhouette at 500 meters. Grace's finger took up the first pressure on the trigger, feeling the heavier-than-standard pull weight. She compensated automatically, finding that perfect balance point where the trigger broke cleanly. The rifle barked, its report echoing through the facility. Through her scope, Grace saw the target rock slightly as her round found its mark, center mass, exactly where she had aimed. Without pausing to verify the hit, she worked the bolt smoothly despite its engineered stiffness, chambering the next round with practiced efficiency. The second target appeared. And again, Grace's shot found its mark. 3 more targets, 3 more hits, each one delivered with the same methodical precision, each one overcoming the subtle sabotage built into the weapon. As the 5th target disappeared, a murmur ran through the watching operators. Perfect score at 500 meters, despite the challenging conditions. Hargrove's face betrayed nothing of his thoughts as he watched through binoculars. Prepare for the 800-meter stage, he ordered, his voice clipped. Grace used the brief pause to adjust her scope for the increased distance. 800 meters was approaching the effective range limit of the M24, a distance where bullet drop, wind drift, and the Coriolis effect all became significant factors. It was a test of not just marksmanship, but mathematical precision and environmental awareness. As she made her adjustments, Martinez moved closer to the firing line. Remember what your father taught you about extreme distance, he said quietly. It's not about the target, it's about the space between you and it. Grace nodded, her eyes never leaving her scope. Her father had spent countless hours teaching her the complex calculations required for extreme distance shooting. How to account for the Earth's rotation, how to read wind patterns across hundreds of meters, how to time the shot between heartbeats. The red light flashed again, signaling the start of the 800-meter stage. The first target appeared, barely visible to the naked eye at this distance. Through her scope, Grace could see it clearly, but she could also see the visual distortion caused by heat waves rising from the ground. The infamous mirage effect that plagued long-distance shooters. This was where her father's special training, what he had called the 5-point system, came into play. More than just a shooting technique, it was a comprehensive approach to extreme marksmanship that combined mathematical precision with almost meditative awareness. Point 1. Calculate the baseline trajectory. Grace's mind worked through the equations for bullet drop at 800 meters with a .308 Winchester round, approximately 295 inches of drop from a zeroed position. Point 2, adjust for atmospheric conditions, temperature, humidity, air density, each factor subtly affecting the bullet's path. The facility was climate controlled at 68 42% humidity. Point 3. Read the wind not just at the firing position, but across the entire path to the target. Grace detected the artificial crosswind generated by the facility's fans, 12 miles per hour from the 3 o'clock position, but with a slight variation at the midpoint where it shifted to 10 miles per hour. Point 4. Account for the Earth's rotation. At this latitude and firing direction, the Coriolis effect would shift the bullet at approximately 3 inches at 800 meters. Point 5. Find the space between heartbeats, the moment of perfect stillness when the body is truly at rest. Grace made her final adjustments, her small fingers moving the turrets with precise, confident motions. When she settled back into position, her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and she found that perfect moment her father had taught her to recognize. The rifle fired, the recoil absorbed smoothly by her positioned body. Through the scope, she saw the target react. Another center mass hit. The second target appeared, and Grace repeated the process. Another hit, then the third target, the fourth, each one requiring slight adjustments as the facility's computers varied the wind conditions, each one finding its mark with unerring precision. As the fifth and final target appeared, Grace felt a moment of perfect clarity, a connection to her father so strong it was almost as if he were there beside her, guiding her aim. She squeezed the trigger at the precise moment between heartbeats. The shot echoed through the facility, followed by a profound silence as everyone waited for confirmation. Sergeant Miller lowered his spotting scope slowly, his face revealing nothing as he turned to Colonel Hargrove. 10 for 10, sir, all center mass. The silence deepened, then broke as the operators began to murmur among themselves. Master Sergeant Reed, the previous record holder, stepped forward to verify the results himself. After a long look through the spotting scope, he turned to face the assembled group. 10 hits, he confirmed, his deep voice carrying easily across the facility. Grouping tighter than mine. He looked directly at Grace, professional respect evident in his eyes. That's some of the finest shooting I've ever witnessed, Miss Harper. Hargrove's face had gone rigid, a muscle working in his jaw as he struggled to maintain his composure. Sergeant Miller, he said tightly, verify the weapon. Make sure it hasn't been modified. Miller checked the M24 thoroughly, examining every component. Standard issue, sir, he reported. Though I do note the trigger pull seems heavier than normal, and the bolt action isn't as smooth as it should be. He looked up, his expression carefully neutral, almost as if someone had intentionally made it more difficult to operate. A ripple of reaction moved through the watching operators. Looks exchanged, eyebrows raised. The implication was clear, and it didn't reflect well on Hargrove. Hargrove ignored Miller's comment, his eyes fixed on Grace. Impressive shooting, Miss Harper, he said, his tone suggesting anything but admiration. But hitting stationary targets, even at distance, is only one small aspect of true combat marksmanship. Grace met his gaze steadily. What would you suggest as a better test, Colonel? Hargrove smiled thinly. Moving targets, variable ranges, limited time, the kind of conditions your father faced in the field. His voice hardened slightly on the mention of Harper. If you're truly his student, perhaps you'd care to try our advanced combat marksmanship simulation. Martinez stepped forward. That wasn't part of our agreement, Hargrove. The qualification course was the agreed test, Hargrove conceded, which she passed admirably. But if she wants to prove herself worthy of her father's legacy, wouldn't she want to face a real challenge? He looked back at Grace. Unless, of course, you're satisfied with what you've accomplished today. Grace understood the manipulation for what it was, a trap designed to either force her to back down or push her into a test beyond her capabilities. But she also recognized the opportunity it presented. What exactly is this simulation, Colonel? Hargrove gestured to the far end of the facility, where a complex setup of moving mechanical targets and electronic sensors waited. The advanced combat marksmanship scenario, multiple targets at varying distances, appearing randomly for 3 seconds or less, some moving, some stationary. It simulates the chaos of real combat environments. He smiled coldly. Your father holds the record. 15 hits out of 20 possible targets. The unspoken challenge hung in the air between them. Grace looked to Martinez, a silent question in her eyes. He gave an almost imperceptible nod. They had prepared for this possibility too. I accept, Grace said simply. Hargrove's smile widened slightly. Excellent. We'll reset the range for the ACMS. He turned to Miller. Standard parameters, 20 targets, varying distances from 300 to 700 meters. As the range crew began preparing the simulation, Martinez drew Grace aside, speaking in low tones. This is exactly what we expected, he said. Hargrove is pushing you toward failure. The ACMS is designed for experienced combat veterans, not 12-year-old girls. I know, Grace finished for him. She looked up at him, her blue eyes clear and determined. But Dad ran me through similar drills at the civilian range. Not as sophisticated, but the same principle. We used remote-controlled targets he built himself. Martinez nodded slowly. Your father always was a step ahead. He squeezed her shoulder gently. Just remember, you don't need to beat his record. Even hitting half the targets would be extraordinary for someone your age. Grace's expression remained solemn. I'm not here to impress them, Sergeant Martinez. I'm here to honor my father and expose the truth about what happened to him. Martinez studied her face, seeing in it the same quiet determination that had defined Michael Harper. Your father would be proud of you, Grace, no matter what happens next. Across the facility, Hargrove was conferring with several operators, his voice too low to carry. Whatever he was saying, it was generating concerned looks from some of the men. Master Sergeant Reed, in particular, seemed to be objecting to something, his posture stiff with disapproval. Eventually, Hargrove returned to where Grace waited. We're ready to begin the simulation, he announced. 20 targets, random presentation, 3 seconds maximum exposure time. Standard scoring rules apply. Grace nodded and moved to the designated firing position. The M24 felt familiar now, its quirks cataloged and compensated for. She settled behind it with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the day. ACMS commencing in 30 seconds, Miller announced. Shooter ready? Ready, Grace confirmed, her voice steady. The facility lights dimmed slightly, focusing attention on the target area where the simulation would unfold. The operators gathered along the sides of the range, many now openly curious about how this unusual competitor would perform. Simulation commencing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Simone. Execute. The first target appeared without warning, a half-size silhouette at approximately 400 meters, moving laterally at walking speed. Grace tracked it smoothly, leading the target slightly to account for its movement, and fired. The target dropped, registering a hit. Then came the true challenge. Targets began appearing randomly across the range, some stationary, others moving. Some exposed for the full 3 seconds, others for barely 1. Distances varied from 300 meters to the promised 700, requiring rapid mental calculations and scope adjustments. Grace worked with machine-like efficiency, acquiring each target, making split-second calculations, and delivering her shots with uncanny precision. The bolt action of the M24, despite its engineered stiffness, cycled smoothly under her practiced hands. Each shot found its mark with a consistency that left the watching operators increasingly amazed. Through it all, Grace maintained the perfect calm her father had instilled in her. Between targets, she adjusted her breathing, keeping her heart rate steady and her mind clear. When targets appeared simultaneously, she prioritized instinctively, nearest first, then the ones with shortest exposure time. 10 targets, 12, 15. Each one registered as a hit, the electronic scoring system logging her performance with implacable precision. The watching operators had fallen completely silent, witnessing something none of them had expected to see. As the 20th and final target dropped, the facility lights returned to normal, and a profound silence filled the space. The digital scoreboard displayed the results: 19 hits out of 20 possible targets. 1 short of perfection, but 4 better than her father's record. Miller stared at the scoreboard, then at Grace, his professional demeanor momentarily broken by genuine amazement. 19 hits, he announced unnecessarily. New facility record. The operators erupted in spontaneous applause, hardened warriors recognizing extraordinary skill regardless of its source. Even those who had been most skeptical were nodding with respect. Master Sergeant Reed approached Grace, extending his hand. That was masterful shooting, Miss Harper, he said as they shook hands. Your father taught you well. Grace nodded, a complex mix of emotions visible in her eyes. Thank you, Sergeant Reed. Hargrove stood apart from the celebration, his face a rigid mask of controlled fury. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. An impressive performance, certainly, almost too impressive. He stepped closer to Grace, towering over her small frame. One might wonder how a 12-year-old civilian achieved such remarkable results on her first attempt at a course designed to challenge our most elite operators. Martinez moved to Grace's side. Are you implying something, Colonel? Hargrove smiled thinly. I'm merely observing that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And what we've witnessed today is, by any standard, extraordinary. He turned to address the assembled operators. While Miss Harper's performance is certainly impressive, we should be cautious about drawing conclusions. The ACMS is a complex system, subject to various technical considerations. One of the Delta operators stepped forward, a weathered veteran with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. With respect, Colonel, I've been running this course for 6 years. What we just saw was legitimate. The kid's a natural. Hargrove's smile never wavered. Perhaps, or perhaps there are factors we haven't considered. He turned back to Grace. In any case, Miss Harper has certainly earned the right to use our facilities as agreed. Congratulations. The words were correct, but the tone made them anything but congratulatory. Hargrove was conceding the battle while making it clear the war was far from over. Grace met his gaze steadily. Thank you, Colonel. I look forward to training here regularly as my father did. Hargrove's eyes hardened at the mention of Harper. Yes, well, we'll see about scheduling. He turned to Miller. Sergeant, secure the range. We're done for today. As Hargrove strode away, Martinez leaned down to speak quietly in Grace's ear. You did it, kid. You beat your dad's record in front of witnesses. Grace watched Hargrove's retreating back, her expression thoughtful. He's not going to let this go, is he? No, Martinez agreed. He's too invested in his version of history, too much at stake. He squeezed her shoulder gently. But neither are we. The operators approached Grace one by one, offering congratulations and, in some cases, apologies for their earlier skepticism. Master Sergeant Reed lingered after the others had moved away. Your father was a good man, he said quietly. One of the best I ever served with. Grace looked up at him, the question in her eyes. Did you know him well? Reed nodded slowly. We trained together, deployed together a few times. He hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. I was supposed to be on that mission in Syria. Got pulled at the last minute, replaced by a guy Hargrove wanted to give experience to. Grace's eyes widened slightly. You knew about the mission? Not the details. Those were classified above my pay grade. Reed glanced in the direction Hargrove had gone, then back to Grace. But I knew your father. He wasn't reckless, despite what some people might say. If he called for support, he needed it. He straightened, his face resuming its professional mask. You've got a gift, Miss Harper. Real talent. If you ever need anything, advice, training, tips, you can find me at the Delta compound. With a final nod to Martinez, Reed moved away, leaving Grace and the old guard veteran standing amid the slowly dispersing crowd of operators. That went better than expected, one of the veterans commented. Hargrove looked like he was about to burst a blood vessel. Martinez nodded, his eyes scanning the facility. He'll regroup, come at us from another angle. We need to be ready. He looked down at Grace. You okay, kid? That was a hell of a performance. Grace nodded, her face showing the first signs of fatigue now that the adrenaline was fading. I'm fine, I wish Dad could have seen it. Martinez's weathered face softened. He did, Grace. In his own way, he was right there with you. He gestured to the scoreboard, still displaying her record-breaking performance. And now everyone else knows what he taught you, what you're capable of. As they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, a young lieutenant approached, slightly nervous in the presence of so many seasoned veterans. Miss Harper, Colonel Hargrove asked me to give you this. He handed her an envelope, then hurried away before she could respond. Grace opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of official letterhead with Hargrove's signature at the bottom. The message was brief. Miss Harper, while your performance today was impressive, I must inform you that all further access to military training facilities will require my personal authorization on a case-by-case basis. Please submit any requests through official channels with a minimum of 2 weeks' notice. Additionally, be advised that unauthorized discussion of classified operations, including those involving your father, constitutes a federal offense under the Espionage Act. Colonel Richard Hargrove, Commander 3rd Special Forces Group. Martinez read the note over Grace's shoulder, his expression darkening. Threats, just what I'd expect from him. Grace folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. He's scared, she said simply. He knows what we have, what we can prove. Maybe, Martinez agreed, but a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. We need to be careful, Grace. Hargrove has resources, connections. He won't go down without a fight. Grace nodded, her young face solemn but determined. Neither will we, Sergeant. Neither will we. The video of Grace's performance hit social media that evening. Despite Hargrove's efforts to prevent recording, someone, likely one of the younger operators, had captured her record-breaking run on the ACMS using a concealed phone. Within hours, it had been viewed millions of times, shared across platforms with captions like, 12-year-old sniper prodigy beats elite special forces record, and Harper's daughter carries on legacy. In her grandparents' modest home just outside Fort Bragg, Grace sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the old guard veterans who had appointed themselves her unofficial security detail. The television in the corner was tuned to a national news channel, where a retired general was discussing the implications of the viral video. Regardless of how one feels about teaching children military skills, the general was saying, there's no denying that what we're seeing here is extraordinary talent. The Harper girl is demonstrating abilities that most trained military snipers work decades to achieve. The camera cut to the anchor, and there are reports that this demonstration was particularly significant because Grace Harper is the daughter of Medal of Honor recipient Lieutenant Michael Harper, who died in Syria 3 years ago under circumstances that some have called into question. Can you speak to that, General? The general's expression grew careful. I'm not familiar with the specific details of Lieutenant Harper's final mission, as those remain classified. What I can say is that he was widely regarded as one of the finest snipers in Special Forces history, and it appears his daughter has inherited his remarkable talent. Martinez muted the television, turning to the assembled veterans. It's working. People are talking. Questions are being asked about Mike's death. One of the veterans, a former intelligence officer named Parker, shook his head cautiously. Hargrove won't take this lying down. He's probably already working to contain the situation. Let him try, another veteran growled. The cat's out of the bag now. Too many people have seen the video, heard the rumors. Rumors aren't enough, Martinez reminded them. We need hard evidence, the kind that can't be buried or explained away. All eyes turned to Grace, who sat quietly reviewing her father's journal. She had been methodically cross-referencing his entries with official mission reports, looking for discrepancies that could be verified through other sources. There's something here, she said, looking up from the journal. Dad mentions a secure transmission on the day before the Syria mission. Something about updated intelligence that contradicted the original briefing. She pushed the journal toward Martinez. He says he reported it to Hargrove directly, warning that the extraction team could be walking into a trap. Martinez studied the entry, his expression grave. If we could find a record of that transmission, it would prove Hargrove sent them in knowing the risks were higher than reported, Parker finished, and that he deliberately ignored information that could have saved lives. Those communications would be classified at the highest level, another veteran pointed out. How do we access them? Grace looked up, her eyes meeting Martinez's. We don't need to access them ourselves. We just need to get the right people asking the right questions. Martinez nodded slowly, understanding her thinking. The Inspector General's office. If there's enough public pressure, enough questions being asked by the right people, they could open an investigation, Parker agreed. But it would take something significant to trigger that kind of response. Something Hargrove couldn't simply deny or explain away. Grace closed her father's journal, her expression resolute. Then we give them something significant, something Hargrove can't ignore or deny. What do you have in mind, kid? Martinez asked, recognizing the determined look that so resembled her father. Hargrove is obsessed with records, with being the best, Grace said. He couldn't stand that my father was a better marksman, a better soldier. That's why he stole credit in Fallujah, why he buried the truth about the Syria mission. She looked around at the veterans, her young face solemn with purpose. So we challenge him where everyone can see. We make it so public, so visible that he can't hide. Challenge him how? One of the veterans asked. Grace's answer was simple, direct, and audacious. The Harper Challenge, a public marksmanship competition in my father's name, open to all qualified military personnel, with one special civilian competitor, me. The veterans exchanged looks, surprised, concerned, but also intrigued. Hargrove would never agree to that, Parker objected. He'd find some way to block it. Not if we go above his head, Martinez said slowly, warming to the idea. The base commander is General Howard. He served with Mike in Afghanistan, respected him enormously. He looked at Grace with newfound appreciation. A memorial competition honoring a Medal of Honor recipient. Howard might just go for it, especially with all the publicity Grace is already generating. And Hargrove would be trapped, another veteran realized. He couldn't refuse to participate without looking cowardly, especially after Grace's performance today. But he also couldn't let Grace win, Martinez added. His ego wouldn't allow it. So either way, we get him in the spotlight. Under pressure, Parker concluded, where he might make a mistake, reveal something he shouldn't. Grace nodded. And we invite the press, make sure everything is recorded, documented. No shadows for Hargrove to hide in. Martinez studied her face, seeing the strategic thinking that went beyond her years. You're not just your father's daughter in marksmanship, are you, kid? You got his tactical mind, too. Grace's expression remained solemn. Dad always said, the best shot in the world is useless without knowing when and why to take it. She looked around at the veterans who had become her unlikely allies. This is our shot. The question is, are we ready to take it? The veterans looked at each other, decades of combat experience reflected in their weathered faces. Then one by one they nodded. The Harper Challenge, Martinez said, testing the name. I like it. He reached out, placing his hand on Grace's shoulder. Your father would be proud, Grace, not just of your shooting, but of your courage. Outside, the autumn wind picked up, rustling the trees around the modest house where this unlikely war council plotted their next move. Somewhere across Fort Bragg, Colonel Hargrove was surely doing the same, unaware that his carefully constructed narrative was about to face its greatest challenge. Not from old soldiers with grudges, but from a 12-year bomb raised with her father's talent, her father's determination, and her father's unshakable sense of justice. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the truth, long buried beneath layers of lease and official denials, was finally stirring, reaching toward the light. The morning of the Harper Challenge dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline autumn day that made Fort Bragg's firing ranges ideal for extreme distance shooting. A light frost covered the grass, glittering like diamond dust in the early morning sun. The air was so still and pure that each breath formed a small cloud, hanging momentarily before dissolving into nothingness. What had begun as a memorial competition honoring a fallen hero had transformed into a media sensation, fueled by the viral videos of Grace Harper's extraordinary performances. News vans lined the access road leading to the long-range marksmanship facility, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like sentinels. Reporters from major networks huddled together, sipping coffee from styrofoam cups as they waited for the event to begin. Behind a temporary barrier, hundreds of spectators had gathered, military families, off-duty soldiers, and civilians drawn by the remarkable story of the 12-year-old girl challenging the military establishment. Many wore T-shirts bearing the hastily designed logo of the Harper Challenge, a stylized scope reticle with the words "One Shot, One Life" beneath it. Veterans stood in clusters, their weathered faces revealing nothing of their thoughts, but their presence spoke volumes. They had come to witness potential history. At the center of this storm of attention stood Grace Harper. Her small figure dwarfed by the media circus surrounding her, she wore simple clothes, jeans, hiking boots, and a windbreaker against the morning chill, but carried herself with the composure of someone far beyond her years. At her side, Martinez maintained a protective presence, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he scanned the crowd. Quite the turnout, he observed quietly. General Howard really came through. Grace nodded, her eyes focused on the firing line where technicians were making final preparations. Is Hargrove here yet? Just arrived, Martinez confirmed, nodding toward a black SUV pulling up to the VIP area. Looks like he brought his entire staff with him. Colonel Richard Hargrove emerged from the vehicle, immaculate in his dress uniform, ribbons and medals gleaming in the morning sun. His face was a mask of professional courtesy as he greeted the assembled officers and dignitaries, but his eyes were cold when they briefly met Grace's across the distance. He doesn't look happy, Grace observed. He had no choice but to come, Martinez replied. General Howard made participation mandatory for all qualified marksmen at Fort Bragg. Hargrove couldn't refuse without raising questions. Grace watched as Hargrove moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with practiced ease. He still thinks he can control this. Let him think that, Martinez said. Overconfidence makes men careless. Besides, we have our own surprises planned. A young lieutenant approached them, saluting Martinez sharply. Sergeant Major, Miss Harper, General Howard requests your presence at the command platform for the opening ceremony. Martinez returned the salute. Lead the way, Lieutenant. As they followed the officer through the crowd, Grace became aware of the whispers and pointing that followed her. Some faces showed admiration, others skepticism, but all held curiosity about the girl who had challenged the military's elite on their own turf. She caught fragments of conversations. Says she outshot half the Delta operators. Can't be real. Has to be some kind of publicity stunt. Harper's daughter, the Medal of Honor recipient. Grace kept her eyes forward, remembering her father's advice. Let them talk. Your shots will speak louder than any words. The command platform stood at the center of the facility, a raised structure offering clear views of the entire range. General Howard, a tall, distinguished officer with silver hair and the weathered face of a career soldier, greeted them with genuine warmth. Miss Harper, he said, extending his hand, it's an honor to finally meet you. Your father was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege of commanding. Grace shook his hand firmly. Thank you for approving the challenge, sir. Howard nodded, his expression growing more serious. Lieutenant Harper deserves to be remembered, and if there are questions about his final mission, they deserve answers. He glanced toward Hargrove, who was making his way to the platform. Truth is the foundation of our service. Without it, we're just men with guns. The subtle message wasn't lost on Grace or Martinez. General Howard might be bound by protocols and chain of command, but he had his own suspicions about what had happened in Syria. Hargrove arrived at the platform, offering a textbook salute to Howard before acknowledging Martinez with a curt nod. He didn't look at Grace at all. Colonel, Howard said, I believe you know Sergeant Major Martinez and Miss Harper. We've met, Hargrove replied, his voice carefully neutral. An interesting event you've organized, General. Howard's smile didn't reach his eyes. A fitting tribute to a Medal of Honor recipient, wouldn't you agree? And an opportunity to showcase the exceptional marksmanship skills our special forces are known for. He turned to address awaiting an aide. We're ready to begin. The opening ceremony was brief but dignified. A color guard, the national anthem, and a moment of silence for fallen warriors. General Howard then addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying easily across the hushed gathering. 3 years ago, this nation lost one of its finest soldiers when Lieutenant Michael Harper gave his life in Syria, saving his teammates in the face of overwhelming odds. Today, we honor his memory with this competition, testing the skills he exemplified throughout his distinguished career. Howard gestured toward Grace. We are also privileged to have with us Lieutenant Harper's daughter, Grace, who has demonstrated remarkable abilities in her own right. As a special participant in today's event, she reminds us that courage and excellence can manifest in the most unexpected places. A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Grace stood straight, her face composed despite the attention focused on her. The Harper Challenge will consist of 3 stages, Howard continued. Standard qualification at 500 meters, advanced marksmanship at 800 meters, and extreme distance shooting at 1,000 meters and beyond. Our judges include master sergeants from all special operations branches, ensuring fair and objective scoring. He surveyed the assembled competitors, 20 of the finest marksmen in the military, including Hargrove and several operators who had witnessed Grace's previous demonstrations. Competitors to your positions. The Harper Challenge begins in 30 minutes. As the crowd dispersed and the competitors moved toward their designated areas, Hargrove approached Grace and Martinez, his voice pitched low to avoid being overheard. "Quite the spectacle you've orchestrated," he said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "But remember, this is a military facility, not a circus. Whatever game you think you're playing ends today." Martinez stepped slightly forward, his posture subtly protective. "The only game being played is the one you started 20 years ago in Fallujah, Richard. Today is about setting the record straight." Hargrove's smile tightened. "Be careful, Frank. Spreading unfounded accusations about a superior officer is a serious offense. So is falsifying mission reports and abandoning your men in combat," Martinez replied evenly. "But we'll let the evidence speak for itself." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Master Sergeant Reed approached. "Excuse me, Colonel Sergeant Major," he said formally. "Miss Harper is requested at the equipment verification station." Hargrove held Martinez's gaze for a moment longer, then nodded curtly and moved away. Reed watched him go, then turned to Grace. "Equipment verification is this way, Miss Harper. We need to check all weapons before the competition begins." As they walked, Reed spoke quietly, his voice too low for others to hear. "Just so you know, 3 of the judges served with your father in Afghanistan. They remember what kind of man he was." Grace nodded, understanding the message. Despite Hargrove's influence, there were still those within the system who valued truth and honor. At the equipment station, Grace presented her rifle for inspection, a standard military-issue M24, the same model she had used in previous demonstrations. The armorer checked it thoroughly, confirming it met all competition specifications. "You're cleared for the first 2 stages, Miss Harper," he informed her. "Do you have a preference for the extreme distance portion?" Grace nodded. "I'd like to use the Barrett M82A1 if possible." The armorer raised an eyebrow. "The Barrett is a significant step up from the M24. It's chambered in 50 BMG, with recoil to match." "I'm familiar with it," Grace replied simply. The armorer studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll have one prepared for the 3rd stage with appropriate modifications for your dimensions." Grace thanked him and moved to her assigned position on the firing line. Around her, the military competitors were settling in, checking their weapons and making final preparations. Hargrove was 3 positions to her right, methodically organizing his equipment with the precision of a career soldier. Martinez approached carrying a small case. "Final checks before we start?" Grace nodded, opening the case to reveal a compact weather station, a gift from one of the old guard veterans. She checked the readings carefully. Temperature 48 degrees. Humidity 62%. Wind from the northwest at 3 mph. Perfect conditions for precision shooting. "Remember," Martinez said quietly, "this isn't just about hitting targets. It's about showing everyone what your father taught you, what he stood for." Grace nodded, her face solemn. "I know." The first stage began without fanfare. Standard qualification at 500 meters, 10 shots per competitor. For experienced military marksmen, this was routine, barely challenging. One by one, they completed their rounds, most achieving perfect or near-perfect scores. Hargrove shot with mechanical precision, placing all 10 rounds within the center ring. As he stepped back from the firing line, he cast a sidelong glance at Grace, his expression unreadable. When Grace's turn came, she approached the line with the same calm focus she had demonstrated in previous tests. The crowd grew quiet, attention shifting to the small figure handling the military rifle with such unexpected familiarity. Her performance was flawless. 10 shots in rapid succession, each finding the exact center of the target with uncanny precision. The judge monitoring her target didn't bother announcing the score. The perfect result was visible to everyone. The second stage, advanced marksmanship at 800 meters, presented greater challenges. Variable winds, smaller targets, in limited time combined to separate the merely good from the truly exceptional. Several competitors faltered, their scores dropping as conditions tested the limits of their abilities. Hargrove maintained his composure, achieving an impressive 9 hits out of 10. He stepped back from the line with quiet confidence, accepting congratulations from several fellow officers. Grace approached the 800-meter challenge with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout. Her adjustments for wind and distance were precise, her breathing controlled, her focus absolute. Again, 10 shots resulted in 10 perfect hits, clustered so tightly at the center of the target that they appeared as a single hole. A murmur ran through the crowd. Hargrove's face darkened momentarily before he mastered his expression. With the first two stages complete, Grace and Hargrove stood tied at the top of the leaderboard, with Master Sergeant Reed close behind. The extreme distance portion would determine the outcome, and it was here that the true test would begin. As the competition paused for equipment changes, Martinez approached Grace with a bottle of water and a protein bar. "How are you holding up, kid?" Grace took a sip of water. "I'm fine, just focused." Martinez nodded, studying her face. "Hargrove is watching you like a hawk. He knows what's coming in the next stage." "Good," Grace replied simply. "I want him paying attention." The announcement for the third stage came over the loudspeakers. "Competitors for extreme distance shooting, please report to your assigned positions. Stage 3 will commence in 15 minutes. The extreme distance portion took place on a separate section of the range, specially designed for shots beyond 1,000 meters. Only the top 5 competitors from the previous stages would participate: Hargrove, Grace, Reed, and 2 other Special Forces operators. As Grace approached her position, she saw the Barrett M82A1 waiting for her, a massive anti-material rifle designed for extreme range engagements. Nearly 5 feet long and weighing over 30 pounds, it was a fearsome weapon capable of accuracy at distances beyond the reach of conventional sniper rifles. The Barrett M82A1 was a semi-automatic rifle chambered for the 50 BMG cartridge, a round originally designed for heavy machine guns. Each brass cartridge stood nearly 6 inches tall, the bullet itself weighing around 650 grains, more than 10 times heavier than standard rifle ammunition. The weapon featured a distinctive muzzle brake that redirected escaping gases to reduce the punishing recoil, and a specialized buffer system in the stock to further tame the massive kick. The optic mounted on the Barrett was equally impressive: a Schmidt & Bender PM2 525-56 scope, the pinnacle of precision shooting technology. The German-made scope featured crystal-clear glass, precise turret adjustments measured in fractions of a minute of angle, and specialized reticle designs that allowed shooters to compensate for bullet drop and wind drift at extreme distances. Hargrove, seeing the Barrett, smiled thinly. "Ambitious choice," he commented. "That rifle has enough recoil to dislocate a grown man's shoulder. It weighs almost as much as you do. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something more appropriate for your size?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "This was my father's preferred rifle for extreme distance work. I've trained with it." Hargrove's smile faded slightly. "Suit yourself. When it breaks your collarbone, don't say I didn't warn you." The armorer approached, carrying what appeared to be a custom mounting system, a modified bipod with additional stabilization features and an adjustable stock extension designed for smaller shooters. "As requested, Miss Harper," he said, attaching the system to the Barrett. "Your father's design, I believe." Grace nodded, running her fingers over the custom mount. "He called it the equalizer. He designed it so we could train together despite our size difference. The equalizer was an ingenious piece of engineering, combining a reinforced bipod with a specialized recoil management system that dispersed the massive energy of the 50 BMG cartridge across a wider area. The stock had been modified with a hydraulic buffer that could be adjusted for the shooter's weight and strength, effectively reducing felt recoil by more than half. Most importantly, it allowed the massive rifle to be operated effectively by someone of Grace's stature without sacrificing accuracy or control. The armorer stepped back, clearly impressed. "Ingenious solution. The recoil management system should reduce felt impact by about 60%. Hargrove watched the exchange with narrowed eyes but said nothing as he prepared his own rifle, a custom Macmillan TAC 338 chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum, the preferred cartridge for military extreme distance shooting. The course of fire was announced: 5 shots at 1,000 meters, followed by a single attempt at 1,500 meters for the top 3 scores. The ultimate challenge, a single shot at Lieutenant Harper's record distance of 1,657 meters, would be attempted only by the winner. As the competitors settled into position, Martinez knelt beside Grace, speaking quietly. Remember everything your father taught you about extreme distance. At this range, you're not just shooting at a target. You're calculating a complex mathematical problem with dozens of variables. Grace nodded, her eyes already focused downrange. I remember. The Barrett was massive compared to her small frame, but with the custom mount, she positioned it with practiced ease. The scope, a Schmidt and Bender PM2 525 by 56, was arguably the finest precision optic in the world, offering unparalleled clarity and adjustment capabilities. The first competitor fired his 5 rounds at 1,000 meters, achieving 3 hits, respectable given the challenging distance. The second managed 4 hits, drawing appreciative nods from the watching operators. Hargrove took his position with confident precision. His first shot found the center of the target, as did his second and third. His fourth shot strayed slightly to the right, still a hit, but not center mass. His fifth returned to dead center. 4 perfect hits, 1 acceptable. An impressive performance that drew applause from the crowd. As Grace prepared for her attempt, Hargrove stood nearby, watching with barely concealed skepticism. Remember, Miss Harper, he said quietly, there's no shame in acknowledging limitations. No one expects a child to match experienced operators at this distance. Grace didn't respond, focusing entirely on her preparation. She checked the Barrett methodically, confirming each component was properly set. The 50 BMG rounds, each nearly 6 inches long, were loaded with careful precision. When she settled behind the rifle, the crowd grew utterly silent. The massive weapon seemed to dwarf her small frame, making her attempt appear almost absurd. Yet there was nothing childlike about her posture, her focus, or the methodical way she adjusted her scope. Through the PM2's crystal-clear optics, Grace studied the target 1,000 meters away, a distance where atmospheric conditions, Earth's rotation, and a dozen other factors became critical considerations. She noted the slight mirage effect caused by temperature differentials above the range, indicating subtle air movements invisible to the naked eye. Her father had taught her to visualize the bullet's entire journey, not just its path, but the forces acting upon it throughout its flight. At extreme distances, a bullet doesn't travel in a simple arc. It dances with the wind, negotiates with gravity, and responds to the spinning of the Earth itself. Imagine you're not just sending a bullet, he told her during their training sessions. You're launching a spacecraft that has to navigate through turbulent atmospheres before landing precisely on a distant planet. Grace made her final calculations, factoring in a wind shift she detected through the mirage in her scope. Her finger took up the first pressure on the trigger, finding that perfect balance point where the slightest additional pressure would break the shot. The Barrett roared, its massive recoil absorbed by the custom mount. Through her scope, Grace saw the target react as her round found dead center. Without pausing to celebrate, she worked the bolt, chambering the next round with smooth efficiency. 4 more times, she repeated the process, each shot delivered with the same methodical precision, each one finding the exact center of the target. When her final round had been fired, she engaged the safety and sat up, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. The judge monitoring her target lowered his spotting scope slowly, his expression one of disbelief. 5 hits, he announced, all within the inner ring, perfect score. A murmur ran through the crowd. Hargrove's face tightened almost imperceptibly. With the 1,000-meter stage complete, Hargrove, Grace, and Master Sergeant Reed advanced to the 1,500-meter challenge, a distance approaching the limits of conventional sniper operations. At this range, even the slightest miscalculation could send a round meters off target. Reed shot first, his single round finding the outer edge of the target, a commendable hit at such an extreme distance. He stepped back from the firing line with professional satisfaction, accepting congratulations from his fellow operators. Hargrove approached his attempt with focused intensity, spending long minutes adjusting his scope and calculating variables. When he finally fired, his shot struck just outside the center ring, an excellent result that placed him in the lead. As Grace prepared for her attempt, Martinez moved closer, speaking in tones too low for others to hear. This is the distance where your father made history in Afghanistan, the shot that earned him his reputation. Grace nodded, her face solemn. I know. The Barrett felt alive in her hands as she settled behind it, like a living extension of her will. At 1,500 meters, the target appeared tiny through her scope, the black silhouette barely distinguishable against its white background. The distance was so extreme that the bullet would spend nearly 2 full seconds in flight, traveling through air currents that could push it off course in dozens of ways. Grace closed her eyes briefly, recalling her father's voice. At extreme distance, you're not aiming at where the target is. You're aiming at where everything will come together. The bullet, the target, the moment of impact. It's like conducting an orchestra where every instrument must reach the perfect note simultaneously. When she opened her eyes, she made 3 small adjustments to her scope, compensating for factors only she could calculate. The crosshair settled on a point that seemed wrong, nearly a meter above and to the left of the actual target, yet her expression showed absolute certainty. The Barrett thundered, its report echoing across the range. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the judge at the target raised his hand, signaling a hit. Through his spotting scope, he confirmed what many thought impossible. Center mass, perfect hit. Hargrove stared downrange, his face a mask of controlled emotion. With this result, Grace had advanced to the final challenge, an attempt at her father's record distance of 1,657 meters, just over 1 mile. As the range crew prepared for the final stage, Hargrove approached Grace. His demeanor had shifted, the cold hostility replaced by something more complex. Miss Harper, he said, his voice low, before you attempt this final shot, there's something you should know. He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Your father's record, 1,657 meters, wasn't his most impressive achievement. Grace looked up, surprised by this unexpected acknowledgement. In 2018, during a classified operation in Afghanistan, Michael made a confirmed kill at 2,125 meters. Hargrove continued, his voice low. It was never officially recorded due to the nature of the mission, but those who were there never forgot it. Martinez stared at Hargrove with open suspicion. Why are you telling her this now? Hargrove's eyes remained on Grace. Because regardless of our differences, your father was an extraordinary marksman. That deserves recognition. He paused. The operation involved preventing a high-level assassination, a single shot through a crosswind at extreme elevation, the kind of shot that defines a career. Grace absorbed this information, her expression unchanging. You knew about this all along. Yes, Hargrove admitted. It was classified above top secret. Still is, technically. Yet you never acknowledged it publicly, never gave him credit for what might be the most extraordinary shot in military history. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Operational security takes precedence over individual recognition. You're old enough to understand that. Grace studied him for a long moment. I understand more than you think, Colonel. My father kept records of all his operations, including that one in Afghanistan. Something flickered in Hargrove's eyes. Concern, perhaps, or calculation. That would be classified information, Miss Harper. Possession of such records would constitute a serious security breach. Only if they contradicted the official narrative, Martinez interjected. Only if they revealed discrepancies that someone might want to keep hidden. The tension between them was interrupted by the range officer's announcement. Final stage ready. Miss Harper, please take your position for the record attempt. Hargrove stepped back, his face once again an unreadable mask. Good luck, Miss Harper. You'll need it. As Grace moved toward the firing line, Martinez stayed close. Be careful, kid. Hargrove doesn't give information freely. He's playing some kind of angle. Grace nodded. I know, but it doesn't matter now. This shot isn't about him. It's about Dad. The firing position for the final attempt had been specially prepared, a raised platform providing an unobstructed line to the target 1,657 meters away, just over 1 mile. At this distance, the target appeared as little more than a speck through even the powerful Schmidt and Bender scope. The crowd had grown completely silent as Grace settled behind the Barrett for the final time. Even those who had been skeptical were now watching with rapt attention, aware they were witnessing something unprecedented. The conditions for the shot were challenging. Wind had picked up to 12 mph, gusting occasionally to 15. The afternoon sun created complex mirage effects across the range. Humidity had risen, subtly affecting ballistic performance. These were conditions that would test the limits of even the most experienced snipers. Grace approached the challenge with methodical precision, making minute adjustments to her scope based on calculations only she fully understood. Martinez approached, kneeling beside her position. In his hand was a single 50 BMG cartridge, different from the standard military rounds she had been using. "I've been saving this for today," he said, presenting it to her. "Your father's hand load. He crafted these specifically for extreme distance work. Custom bullet, precisely measured powder charge, the case neck turned to perfect concentricity. The round was a work of art to those who understood precision shooting. Unlike factory ammunition, this cartridge had been meticulously crafted by Michael Harper himself. The brass case had been weight sorted and the neck turned to ensure perfect alignment with the bullet. The powder charge had been measured to 1/10 of a grain for consistent velocity. The bullet itself was a custom design, a lathe-turned solid copper projectile with an optimized ogive for superior aerodynamics. Even the primer had been specially selected and seated to precise depth for consistent ignition. Grace took the round reverently, examining the cartridge her father had prepared with such care. "His 1-mile load," she said softly. Martinez nodded. "He had it with him in Syria. Never got the chance to use it." He placed his hand on her shoulder. "Seems fitting it should complete the journey in your hands." Grace loaded the special round into the Barrett. Around them, the crowd watched in hushed anticipation. In the VIP area, Hargrove stood with General Howard and, to everyone's surprise, a distinguished older officer with 3 stars on his shoulders who had arrived without fanfare during the competition. "Who's that?" Grace whispered to Martinez. "General Thomas Wilson," Martinez replied, his voice low. "Commander of Joint Special Operations Command. Your father served under him in Afghanistan." Grace's eyes widened slightly. The presence of JSOC's commander added an entirely new dimension to the event. This was no longer just about a marksmanship competition. The highest levels of Special Operations Command were now watching. Grace returned her attention to the task at hand. The distance was extreme, the longest shot she had ever attempted. But she had prepared for this moment for years, absorbing everything her father could teach her about the art and science of extreme distance shooting. She settled behind the rifle, running through her father's 5-point system one final time. Calculate trajectory, account for conditions, read the wind, adjust for Coriolis, find the space between heartbeats. Grace made her final adjustments, her small fingers moving the turrets with precise, confident motions. When she settled back into position, her breathing slowed, her heartbeat steadied, and she found that perfect moment her father had taught her to recognize. "This is for you, Dad," she whispered, too softly for anyone to hear. The Barrett fired, its massive report rolling across the range like thunder. The special round her father had crafted began its long journey, a journey measured not just in meters, but in years of preparation, of lessons learned, of promises kept. For nearly 3 seconds, the world held its breath. Then the judge at the extreme distance target raised both hands high above his head, the signal for a perfect hit. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Hardened operators shook their heads in amazement. Martinez closed his eyes briefly, a complex mix of emotions crossing his weathered face. Through it all, Grace remained composed, engaging the Barrett's safety before sitting up. Her face revealed little of her thoughts, but those who knew her well might have glimpsed the quiet satisfaction in her eyes. Not triumph over her competitors, but fulfillment of a promise made at her father's grave. As she stood, Martinez was the first to reach her, clasping her shoulder with gentle pride. "He saw that, kid. Wherever he is, he saw that." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. The official confirmation came moments later. Hit confirmed at 1,057 meters. Center mass. New range record established. Duh. Hargrove watched from a distance, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. When General Howard approached him, he straightened automatically to attention. Quite a demonstration, wouldn't you say, Colonel? Howard remarked, his eyes on Grace as she accepted congratulations from the assembled operators. Impressive marksmanship, Hargrove acknowledged stiffly. The Harper talent clearly runs in the family. Howard's gaze sharpened. Yes, it does, which makes one wonder about certain inconsistencies in the Syria after-action reports. He turned to face Hargrove directly. My office has received some concerning information, Colonel. Communications logs that don't match official records, witness statements that contradict the timeline you provided. Hargrove's face paled slightly. Sir, those operations were classified. I have the necessary clearance, Colonel, Howard interrupted, as does the Inspector General, who will be reviewing all materials related to Lieutenant Harper's final mission. His voice hardened. If there were delays in support authorization, if crucial intelligence was ignored or suppressed, there will be consequences, regardless of rank or service record. Before Hargrove could respond, they were interrupted by the approach of General Wilson. The JSOC commander had observed the entire competition without comment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. General Howard, Wilson greeted his colleague. Remarkable event you've organized here. Howard returned the greeting, noting Hargrove's increased tension at Wilson's arrival. Thank you for attending, General. I believe you knew Lieutenant Harper. Wilson nodded solemnly. One of our finest. I was in Afghanistan when he made his record shot. He glanced at Hargrove. The official record, that is. Hargrove stiffened almost imperceptibly. Sir, Wilson's gaze was penetrating. I've been watching with great interest, Colonel. Not just today's competition, but the events leading up to it. The questions being raised about Lieutenant Harper's final mission. The emergence of his daughter's extraordinary abilities. He paused. And your reactions to all of it. Hargrove maintained his professional demeanor, but a sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead. Sir, if there are questions about operational decisions, I'm prepared to address them through proper channels. I'm counting on that, Colonel, Wilson replied evenly, because I've authorized a full investigation into the Syria incident. All communications, all orders, all decisions will be thoroughly examined. His voice remained conversational, but his eyes were hard as flint. Truth is a cornerstone of Special Forces operations, Colonel. Without it, trust fails. And without trust, men die unnecessarily. The implication hung in the air between them. Hargrove's composure finally cracked, his face showing the first signs of genuine fear. General, the operational environment in Syria was extremely complex. Decisions had to be made with limited information. Wilson held up a hand, stopping Hargrove mid-sentence. Save it for the investigation, Colonel. For now, I believe we have a champion to congratulate. He moved toward Grace, leaving Hargrove standing rigid with barely contained anxiety. Howard lingered a moment longer. You have 3 days to get your affairs in order, Colonel, he said quietly. I suggest you use them wisely. At the awards podium, Grace stood flanked by Martinez and the Old Guard veterans as General Wilson presented her with a special commemoration, a custom-engraved plaque honoring both her achievement and her father's legacy. The inscription read simply, Harper Challenge Champion, carrying the legacy forward. Your father would be extraordinarily proud, Miss Harper, Wilson said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. Not just of your marksmanship, which is remarkable, but of your determination to honor his memory and uphold the values he represented. Grace accepted the plaque with quiet dignity. Thank you, sir. My father taught me that shooting was never about the target. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Wilson nodded, genuine respect in his eyes, a lesson many could benefit from remembering. He glanced briefly toward Hargrove before continuing. I've also authorized the declassification of certain records pertaining to your father's service, including his extraordinary shot in Afghanistan at 2,125 meters. It's time the world knew the full extent of his contributions. A murmur ran through the crowd. Grace's eyes widened slightly. This was unexpected vindication, coming from the highest levels of command. Additionally, Wilson continued, I'm pleased to announce the establishment of the Harper Marksmanship Academy, a specialized program for developing exceptional talents regardless of age or background. He smiled at Grace. We'd be honored if you would consider serving as our first civilian instructor, Miss Harper. Grace looked to Martinez, who nodded encouragingly. I would be honored, General, she replied, her composure remarkable for someone so young. As the ceremony concluded, Grace found herself surrounded by operators offering congratulations and respect. Men who had initially viewed her with skepticism, now acknowledging her extraordinary gift. Master Sergeant Reed approached last, extending his hand with genuine admiration. I thought I had seen everything in 20 years of service, he said as they shook hands. But what you did today rewrote the book on extreme distance shooting. He glanced toward Hargrove, who stood apart from the celebration, his isolation palpable, and maybe rewrote some other books too. Grace followed his gaze. What will happen to him? Reed's expression turned grim. That depends on what the investigation finds, but based on what I've heard, his career is effectively over. He studied her face curiously. Does that give you satisfaction? Grace considered the question thoughtfully. No, she said finally. My father never sought revenge, even when he was wronged. He just wanted the truth to be known. She looked back at Reed. That's all I wanted, too. As the crowd began to disperse, Hargrove approached Grace and Martinez. The arrogance had drained from him, leaving a man who seemed suddenly older, diminished by the weight of truths he could no longer suppress. Miss Harper, he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. Sergeant Major. Martinez positioned himself slightly in front of Grace, protective even in victory. Say what you need to say, Hargrove. Hargrove looked past Martinez to Grace, something almost like respect in his eyes. You shot extraordinarily well today. Your father would be proud. Grace met his gaze steadily, saying nothing. I want you to know, Hargrove continued, that whatever happens with the investigation, whatever they find, your father was an exceptional soldier, the best I ever served with. He hesitated, seeming to struggle with his next words. I didn't always acknowledge that. Perhaps I should have. Perhaps, Grace agreed quietly. Hargrove nodded, accepting the implicit rebuke. They'll be coming for my resignation tomorrow. Possibly worse, depending on what they find in the communications logs. He straightened slightly, some remnant of pride returning to his bearing. But I wanted to tell you myself. You earned your victory today, fair and square. With a final nod to Martinez, Hargrove turned and walked away, his shoulders bearing the invisible weight of approaching judgment. That's as close to an apology as that man will ever give, Martinez observed. Grace watched Hargrove's retreating figure thoughtfully. It's not about him anymore. It never really was. 6 months later, Grace stood beside her father's grave at Arlington National Cemetery. The spring sun warmed the pristine white headstones, stretching in perfect rows across the gentle hills. She placed fresh flowers beside the marker, then carefully arranged 2 medals on the small shelf at the base of the stone. The first was her father's Medal of Honor, temporarily removed from its frame for this personal ceremony. Beside it, she placed a new medal, the Army's Civilian Service Medal of Honor, awarded to her following the completion of the investigation into the Syria incident. The findings had been unequivocal. Hargrove had deliberately delayed authorization for air support following Harper's distress call, ignoring critical intelligence and falsifying subsequent reports. His motivation, a 20-year grudge stemming from Fallujah, had resulted in Harper's death and the wounding of 4 other operators. Hargrove had been dishonorably discharged, stripped of rank and benefits, his career and reputation destroyed by his own actions. But for Grace, that outcome had never been the goal. It's done, Dad, she said softly to the headstone. Everyone knows the truth now, about Syria, about Afghanistan, about everything. The gentle spring breeze rustled the leaves of the nearby trees, the only sound in the peaceful sanctuary. General Wilson kept his promise about the academy, she continued. We have 20 students already, some military, some civilian, all learning your methods, your philosophy. A small smile touched her lips. Martinez says I'm a tougher instructor than you were. I don't think that's possible. She touched the cool marble of the headstone, tracing her father's name with gentle fingers. The range at Fort Bragg has been renamed. It's the Harper Marksmanship Facility now. They even put up a small museum display with your rifle and your records. Her voice softened. Your real records. In the distance, a military honor guard performed its solemn duty, accompanying another fallen hero to eternal rest. Grace watched for a moment, respecting their precision and dignity. The old guard veterans still come around all the time, she said, returning her attention to her father's grave. They tell me stories about you, the ones you were too modest to share yourself. Martinez says they've adopted me as the daughter of the regiment. I think he meant it as a joke, but it doesn't feel like one. She fell silent for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I broke your long-distance record last month, 2,200 meters, verified by 3 independent spotters. General Wilson was there. He said it was unprecedented. Her smile turned slightly mischievous. I think you'd still have a few tricks to teach me, though. A family passed nearby, paying respects to their own fallen warrior. They nodded respectfully to Grace, recognizing her from the news coverage that had followed the Harper Challenge and the subsequent investigation. People ask me sometimes if I'm angry about what happened, Grace continued when they had passed. About Hargrove, about how long it took for the truth to come out. She considered the question again, as she had many times. I'm not angry, Dad. You taught me that anger clouds judgment, disrupts focus. What matters is that your story is known now. Your legacy is secure. She knelt beside the grave, arranging the flowers more precisely. Martinez asked what comes next. I told him I'm just getting started. Her voice took on a hint of her father's quiet determination. The academy is growing. We're developing new techniques, new technologies, everything built on your foundation. Standing again, Grace took a step back, looking at the headstone with its simple inscription, Michael Harper, Lieutenant, United States Army, Medal of Honor. Below recently added, holder of the world record for long-distance marksmanship, 2,125 meters. In a way, Hargrove gave me my greatest opportunity, she reflected, the chance to prove what you taught me, to show the world who you really were. She smiled slightly. Sometimes our greatest enemies become our best teachers without meaning to. As the afternoon sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the sacred ground, Grace stood in silent communion with her father's memory. No words were needed for what passed between them. The bond that transcended death, the legacy that would continue through her hands and heart. I miss you every day, she said finally, but I feel you with me every time I take position behind a rifle, every time I find that perfect space between heartbeats. With a final touch to the headstone, Grace turned to leave, walking with purpose through the endless rows of markers. She was no longer just Michael Harper's daughter, though she would always carry that honor with pride. She had become something more, a guardian of his legacy, a standard bearer for his values, and in her own right, a remarkable individual whose journey was only beginning. As she reached the cemetery gates, Martinez waited beside a government vehicle, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile at her approach. Ready for the demonstration at Quantico? He asked as she joined him. The FBI's top marksmen are pretty confident they can outshoot a 12-year-old girl. Grace's eyes sparkled with quiet confidence. They're welcome to try, Sergeant Major. They're welcome to try. Together, they drove away from Arlington, leaving behind a legacy honored and a promise fulfilled. But they carried forward something equally powerful. The truth finally brought to light, and the knowledge that even the most carefully constructed deceptions cannot stand forever against those determined to expose them. One shot, one life. Not to kill, but to protect. The Harper legacy would continue in ways even Michael Harper might never have imagined. Through the hands, heart, and unbreakable spirit of the extraordinary daughter who had promised to keep his memory alive. And promises, as Grace Harper had proven beyond any doubt, were meant to be kept.